It was just past midnight when I finished my usual rounds and started walking toward room 209. The hospital was unusually quiet, a silence that felt almost suffocating. Most of the patients had already been discharged or were fast asleep. I tried to shake off the growing unease in my chest as I approached the room. It had been a long shift, and I was ready to get it over with. But something in the air felt off, like I was being watched, though I knew that was impossible. I'd been doing this job long enough to tell when things were just my imagination playing tricks. When I reached room 209, I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, so faint that I questioned whether I had seen anything at all. But there it was again, a shadow, an outline of a figure sitting in the bed. I froze in place, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. This didn't make sense. Mr. Jacobs, the patient who had been in that bed earlier, was discharged hours ago. I personally helped him into a wheelchair myself before he left, so there was no reason for someone to be in that bed now. The hospital was small, and I knew every patient on this floor by name. But the movement continued, so subtle that I couldn't be sure. I could just make out the shape of someone sitting, their back hunched, the faintest impression of a head resting against the pillow. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but my instincts told me I needed to check. I tried to steady my breath. The thought of waking up one of the other nurses or calling security felt unnecessary. It had to be some sort of mistake, right? Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe I was just tired. I pushed the door open cautiously, trying not to disturb whatever was in there. The last thing I wanted was to scare someone who might just be confused, maybe even a late-night visitor who had snuck in. But as the door creaked open, I immediately noticed something else, the monitor. It was still beeping. The steady rhythm of the machine's beep echoed in the room, and I was sure that it wasn't supposed to be on. I'd seen Mr. Jacobs's chart earlier. There was no reason for any equipment to still be running after he was discharged. That's when I felt the chill in the room hit me. The air wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, thick. Like something was off. I stepped into the room, my heart racing as I scanned the space. There was no one in the bed. The figure I had seen through the doorway was gone. The bed was empty. My mind began to race with possibilities. Maybe someone had returned. A visitor, perhaps? But the door had been shut and locked when I approached. I was the only one on the floor at this time of night. I took a hesitant step forward, eyes glued to the monitor. It was still displaying the same readings, heart rate, oxygen levels, blood pressure, all perfect, all normal. But there was no one in the bed. I couldn't explain it. I glanced at the door again, as though expecting someone to walk in and explain what was going on. But the room remained still, eerily quiet, aside from the persistent beeping of the machine. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I walked toward the monitor. I needed to reset it. Maybe it was just malfunctioning. I pressed the buttons, and the beep stopped for a moment. The green lines on the screen stuttered, flickered, and then went flat. I sighed in relief. It had to be a glitch, right? Nothing more than that. But as I turned to leave, the beep came back, sharp, loud, and unsettling. I froze, my eyes snapping back to the screen. The vital signs were back, new readings, fresh as if they had just appeared. But the bed was still empty. I took a step forward, my hands trembling as I reached for the monitor, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. What was happening? My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. The beep continued, and for a moment, I thought I saw something. A shadow, a shift of movement, but when I blinked, it was gone. The room was as empty as it had been moments before. I tried to shake it off, but I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't understand. It didn't make sense. There was no one in the room. The readings on the screen were now cycling through, but the bed, the whole room, was empty. There was nothing. I glanced at the door once more, checking the hallway. Was someone messing with me? Maybe one of the doctors was playing a joke on me. But no one was there, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized there was no explanation. No reason for the monitor to still be running. No reason for the bed to still be empty. No reason for the shadow in the first place. I turned away from the monitor, and my eyes landed on the clock. It had been only a few minutes, but it felt like time had stopped. I was suddenly acutely aware of the emptiness of the room. The quietness was suffocating. The beeping kept echoing in my ears, louder now, as if mocking me. I wasn't sure if I was hearing things, or if it was real. I didn't want to find out, but I also couldn't leave. I felt like I needed to stay, to understand what was happening, to make sense of this feeling that was growing inside me. I took one last look at the bed before I backed away slowly. Something told me not to turn my back. not to leave the room so easily. As I reached for the door, the monitor beeped again. This time it was a different sound. More urgent. More insistent. My body froze. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. The silence after the beep was deafening. And that's when it hit me, Mr. Jacobs was gone. He had been gone for hours. Yet the room was alive. The machines were working as if someone was there. But there was no one in the room. I stood frozen in the doorway, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My body refused to move, and my mind was a jumble of thoughts, none of which made any sense. The beep of the monitor still rang in my ears, louder now, more insistent. I could feel the air around me thicken, as though the room itself was holding its breath. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to do something. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I just knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. It didn't matter how many times I told myself that there was a logical explanation. Nothing felt right. I glanced back toward the bed again. The sheets were perfectly made, not a single wrinkle or disturbance. If someone had been sitting there, surely the blankets would be askew, right? But nothing was out of place. It was almost like the bed hadn't been touched in hours. The thought struck me that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the fatigue from my shift was catching up to me. I had been working nonstop, after all. But then the monitor beeped again, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound was like a sharp whisper in my ear, and I couldn't ignore it. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't in my head. I slowly stepped back into the room, my legs feeling heavy with each movement. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to steady my breath, but it came out shallow and quick. I reached for the monitor, hesitating for a second before I touched it. The buttons felt cold beneath my fingers. I reset the machine again, hoping that would stop the readings from cycling, hoping that I was just overreacting. But as soon as I released my hand, the monitor beeped once more. The same steady rhythm, as though nothing had changed. The screen was displaying new vital signs again, numbers that hadn't been there moments before. I backed away from the monitor, my mind racing. How was this happening? I turned to look at the bed again, expecting to see someone, but the sheets were still neatly arranged, undisturbed. The room was exactly as it had been when I first entered, except for the persistent beeping of the machine. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that maybe I was just too tired, too stressed from the long shift. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was something about the way the room felt. It was like it was alive, like the air itself was pulsing with a strange energy. I glanced at the clock. It was only a few minutes since I'd last checked. Time felt like it was stretching, warping in this place. The seconds seemed to crawl by, each one dragging heavier than the last. I couldn't leave, not yet. I needed to figure out what was going on. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the feeling of dread creeping over me. I glanced toward the window, but there was nothing to see. Just the empty parking lot outside, bathed in the glow of a single streetlight. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above, the faintest buzz that only added to the tension in the air. I turned back to the bed, my eyes scanning the room one more time. I was searching for any sign that could explain what I was feeling. But there was nothing. It was just as empty as it had been the first time I stepped inside. I reached out for the door handle, thinking that maybe I could just leave, forget this ever happened. But before my hand could touch it, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a soft, muffled sound coming from the corner of the room. It was like a faint breathing, barely audible but undeniable. My body stiffened and I froze. I tried to tell myself that it was just the wind, or maybe the HVAC system kicking in, but the sound was too specific, too human. I slowly turned toward the corner of the room, my eyes scanning the shadows. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual hospital equipment, a chair by the window, and the corner where the small sink was located. But then I saw it. In the very corner, by the window, a shadow. It was barely perceptible, but it was there, something dark and formless lurking in the dim light. I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't even breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest again, louder than the beeping of the monitor. I felt like I was suffocating, like the air was being sucked out of the room. For a moment, I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I was just too terrified to think straight. But then the shadow shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement, but it was enough to make me gasp. I was sure I hadn't imagined it. My eyes locked on the corner, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The sound of breathing, slow and shallow, grew louder, and my body screamed at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in the room with whatever this was. I took a step back, my foot making a soft sound on the tile floor. The shadow didn't move. It didn't react. But I knew it was there, and I knew it was watching me. I could feel its presence in the room, heavy and suffocating. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I couldn't see it clearly, but the unease in my chest told me everything I needed to know. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be there. The monitor beeped again, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't the steady, rhythmic beep of vital signs. It was more like a warning, like something was trying to get my attention. I slowly backed away from the corner, my feet moving cautiously. I didn't want to take my eyes off the shadow, but I couldn't stand being so close to it. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how to explain it. All I knew was that the room was wrong. The air was thick, the sound of the monitor, and the breathing too loud. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears, and the more I tried to rationalize it, the less it made sense. There was something in that room, something that didn't belong there. And I was terrified of what would happen if I stayed any longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that the room had somehow changed. It was like the walls were closing in on me, pressing down with an invisible weight. The shadow in the corner was still there, and though I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, I knew deep down that it wasn't. The air felt thick, like it was harder to breathe, like something was blocking the flow of oxygen. I tried to move, to leave the room, but my legs felt like they were stuck to the floor. Every inch of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move. I felt trapped, paralyzed. The monitor beeped again, and this time, the sound was almost deafening. The screen displayed new vital signs, as if someone was hooked up to it. But there was no one in the bed. I glanced back at the bed, half expecting to see someone lying there, but of course it was empty. The sheets were still pristine, perfectly smooth. Nothing had changed. But the beeping of the monitor was insistent, constant, like it was mocking me. It was like the machine knew something I didn't, something I couldn't understand. And the shadow in the corner seemed to grow darker, more defined. I wanted to shout. I wanted to call for help. But the words were stuck in my throat. My mouth felt dry, like I had swallowed a handful of sand. The more I tried to breathe, the harder it became. I felt lightheaded, disoriented. I had to leave. I had to get out of this room before I completely lost my mind. But as I turned to leave, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, spinning around to face whatever was there. But the room was empty. The shadow had not moved. It remained still, almost as if it were waiting for me to make the next move. I was starting to question my own sanity. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe I was hallucinating. But then the footsteps came again, closer this time, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. I was too afraid of what I might see. I thought about running, but my feet wouldn't obey me. I was rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was oppressive, thick with dread, like the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I could feel it. Something was about to change. I tried to steady my breathing, but it came in quick, shallow gasps. My chest was tight, and the pressure only seemed to increase as I stood there, in the middle of the room, surrounded by nothing but the sound of the monitor and the oppressive silence. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I glanced at the door, but it seemed so far away, like it was just out of reach. I needed to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. Something was stopping me. Something in this room was keeping me there. I could feel it in my bones. The monitor beeped again, louder this time, almost deafening. The screen flashed rapidly, showing a jumble of numbers that didn't make sense. I reached for it, hoping to turn it off, to stop whatever was happening. But as soon as my hand made contact, I felt a jolt, an electric shock that sent a ripple of pain through my body. I pulled my hand back, startled, and the monitor stopped beeping, but the numbers on the screen were still shifting, as though something was adjusting them from within. The shadow in the corner flickered. I blinked, unsure if I had seen it move, but when I looked again, it was clearer, darker, more solid than before. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice. It was more like a feeling, an emotion. A wave of cold dread that washed over me, filling me with an overwhelming sense of fear. It was like the shadow was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear the words. All I could feel was the terror. The air in the room turned icy cold, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. It was as though the temperature had dropped to freezing in a matter of seconds. I pulled my coat tighter around me, hoping it would shield me from the cold that seemed to be creeping under my skin. But it didn't help. Nothing could help. I turned away from the monitor and the shadow, trying to make a break for the door. But as I took a step forward, the floor beneath me groaned, like the building itself was shifting. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, but I caught myself. My heart was racing now, pounding in my chest as I moved toward the exit. But just as I reached the door, it slammed shut, and I couldn't open it. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my chest, and I started pounding on the door, yelling for help, but no sound escaped my mouth. It was like I had been silenced, trapped in a room with something I couldn't see but could feel all around me. I was trapped. There was no way out, no one around to hear me. The fear that had been creeping at the edges of my mind turned into full-blown terror. My heart raced, my breath quickened, and the coldness in the room seemed to deepen. I could feel the walls closing in on me, the very air around me thick with something I couldn't explain. I turned back to the bed, to the monitor, hoping it would give me some sign, some clue as to what was happening. But it was the same. The screen flickered with strange numbers. The beeping was constant, like a heartbeat, like it was waiting for something. I took a step toward the bed, but then I felt it again, the pressure in the air, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. I froze. Something was there, behind me. I could feel it even if I couldn't see it. My spine tingled, every hair on my body standing on end. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was suffocating in the silence, my own fear choking me. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing except the shadow, which had grown more distinct, more solid, as if it were feeding off my fear. The shadow moved then, shifting in a way that made my stomach lurch. It was slow at first, as if it were stretching, growing taller, wider. My body shook involuntarily as the cold intensified, but I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The shadow reached out toward me, its edges frayed, like a dark mist that had taken on form. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The cold disappeared, the monitor went quiet, and the shadow, whatever it was, seemed to shrink back into the corner. For a long moment, I just stood there, not daring to move. I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming, or if I had lost my mind. Was I still in that room? Or had I slipped into another dimension, where nothing made sense anymore? The beeping started again, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the monitor. It was coming from the hallway, echoing through the silent halls of the hospital. I wanted to run toward it, to escape whatever had just happened, but when I stepped toward the door, I froze again. The footsteps. I heard them, clear as day. Slow, deliberate, like someone was walking toward me, but I couldn't see anyone. No one was there. The footsteps were coming closer, and my heart pounded harder in my chest. I grabbed the door handle again, desperate, but this time it opened. The hallway was empty. Completely empty. I rushed out of the room, my feet barely touching the floor as I ran, not caring about anything but escaping whatever nightmare I had just lived through. When I reached the nurse's station, I was out of breath, shaking uncontrollably. I tried to tell someone what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't explain it. No one would believe me. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen or hadn't seen. I knew that something in that room wasn't right. But when I asked the other nurses about room 209, they looked at me like I was crazy. There had been no patient in that room for hours, and no one had touched the monitor since the last shift. The nurse who had discharged the patient earlier that evening confirmed that the room was empty, as it had been for hours. But I knew what I had experienced. The strangest part? When I checked the log the next morning, room 209 had been marked as vacant since the patient left. But the monitor records showed reading new vital signs every hour from the time I left the room until I came back on the next shift. Nothing added up. It didn't make sense. I still don't know what happened that night or what I saw, but I've never set foot in that room again. And every time I pass it in the hallway, I feel the same chill, the same unease. I don't know what was in there with me, but I know I wasn't alone.